right, welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast about connecting history to current events. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jay, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host Colin. This week, we are talking about the start of the Chinese Civil War. Last week, we talked about how the United States and China supported one another and how the United States protected China, at least made the attempt diplomatically from mainly Japan during World War I and in the early 20s. In this episode, we're going to kick off the Civil War where the CCP and the Kuomintang start fighting each other. So, Colin, what are our key takeaways for today?
Thanks, Jay. And I got to say, I always love your intros. It's so high energy. It really gets me pumped up to talk about history.
Yeah. I love this stuff.
So I think starting with the first key takeaway, the KMT and Shanghai were not this pro-Western capitalists. And I feel like that is maybe not necessarily explicitly said, but coming out of just basic high school world history and kind of progressing on through just general knowledge pickup, I feel like a lot of people, when they say it was like, oh, the nationalists versus the communists, and we supported Chiang Kai-shek, and we kind of build this idea that he was this pro-Western capitalist and he was more, in favor of our policies and democracy and everything. And it's really not true. And I do think it's important that we dispel that myth, or kind of get an idea of who Chiang Kai-shek really actually was, in order to understand the Civil War more, and then U.S. policy as a whole within China moving forward. So then I do want to talk about, for the second key takeaway, the external forces that were operating on the Chinese. So you had these Western powers who were primarily the U.S. and the British. Obviously, we had talked about the past several episodes that things had changed since the Boxer Rebellion. The U.S. was trying to protect China diplomatically, but what that actually looked like as the Civil War breaks out and the Japanese begin attacking Manchuria. Then you've got the Soviets who are exporting their communist ideology and really infiltrating into some key future leaders within the CCP. And then you had the Japanese and the Germans even, who were occupying and influencing different Chinese players. So, and then for the final one, this is sort of my take on why Chiang Kai-shek lost the Civil War or began to. I think it's because he lacked the ability to win the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. And hearts and mind is a very American term, I feel like, that was made popular during the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And that was sort of our strategy, trying to win and rebuild the country. But I think it is actually important here because on the other side, Mao actually was able to do that, and the Communist Party was able to do that, and they were successful because of it over this very long 20-plus year conflict between the two. So, and then I think the question that we need to keep in mind while we talk about all of this is, how does this affect the U.S. and Chinese relations today? Because, before it was this century of humiliation, and the United States, we were looking at the Chinese and why they sort of act the way that they do and distrust the West. But now we're getting into events that have a direct impact on what is going on now, like the formation of the CCP and the CCP taking over, which is the current regime in China. So I think that's a question we need to keep in the back of our minds and ultimately answer.
Yeah. This whole series is about U.S.-Chinese relations, but we're studying and we're talking about U.S.-Chinese relations ultimately to understand the dynamic between U.S. and China. And, Colin and I are Americans. Most of our listeners are from the United States. So we're coming at it from a uniquely Western American perspective, and that perspective has historically failed to understand not just China, but just Asia on the whole. Like Korea, we were completely blindsided. Vietnam was a complete and utter quagmire. Today, our relationship with the Philippines is super rocky, and a lot of it boils down to we struggle understanding the dynamics in that current country. So as we talk about the Chinese Civil War, during World War II, the United States was heavily involved in China. How well we understood the situation is debatable. So today, like if we're going to understand China, we need to talk about its history and understand like this is, the Chinese Civil War is a significant event in the last 500 years of Chinese history.
Yeah,
So that's why we're going to talk about it.
I just had this thought as you mentioned that, kind of looking at it through a Western lens. Like, if you were to compare the U.S. Civil War and the Chinese Civil War, that's kind of how I always thought of the Chinese Civil War. Like, there's these very two clearly delineated sides, and both of them had this kind of front and ideology. And that's really not true. The more I get into this and study this, I'm like, wow, this is way more complex. There's all these different leaders and factions within each side that is going on. Oh, and then by the way, there's all these different countries that are trying to take a piece and influence you. So, yeah, you're right. So let's get started with that. So I think this might be the last time we mention it, but I do want to start with Sun Yat-sen. In 1925, he dies. So if we remember Sun Yat-sen, he had a heavy Western influence. He was an American citizen because he lived in Hawaii. But I think as we look back, if we remember, he had the three principles of the people: nationalism, socialism, and democracy. So he was not like this capitalist. He actually became very sympathetic and heavily influenced by the Soviets, specifically Mikhail Borodin, who became one of his trusted confidants. And the CCP actually today calls him a pioneer of the revolution, which I thought was really interesting because he was not a member of the CCP, but they still view him as a pioneer of the revolution, because even though he was nominally a Christian and actually looked favorably on the United States for the most part, he didn't believe in this individualistic, idea of human rights. It was really more of the state that he kind of wanted to nationalize, and looked at it through this lens. And he kind of wanted to recapture this Confucian ideology. And that his rising star, Chiang Kai-shek, who was a military man, he became the successor within the KMT. So I do want to give a little background on Chiang Kai-shek, because moving forward, he's going to be one of the two real key players. So Chiang Kai-shek was born in 1887 to a middle-class kind of merchant family, and most of his life was spent in the military or training in the military, which I thought was actually kind of interesting, because there were 2 years he spent in the Japanese military. And that's important to remember, because if you start to study him and kind of get a framing of what he was like as a man, I have to think he was kind of this military Spartan-esque type of character who believed in, strict discipline and kind of a merchant upper middle class type of character. And even though when he was in Japan, he came back during the Wuchang Rebellion uprising, and was one of the founders of the KMT with Sun Yat-sen. And that's kind of where he and Sun Yat-sen began their relationship. And during the Yuan Shikai and the warlord era, he kind of disappeared into obscurity, but comes back when Sun Yat-sen starts making a push for power sometime around 1918, when after the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviets reached out, started influencing Sun Yat-sen. He founds some military academies at Whampoa and eventually Canton. So he becomes kind of the head of the military. Like I said, he's a military guy. He sort of emulates Sun Yat-sen almost down to the T, with a military kind of Spartan-esque personality added to it. So he believed in the nationalization of industry. He was in favor of the three principles of the people. He actually became a Christian later. He marries Sun Yat-sen's sister-in-law, and they were a very influential family. And he actually became a Christian, which I also think is important, kind of trying to understand where he was.
I didn't know that.
He did, yeah. He eventually converts to Christianity. I think he met Sun Yat-sen's sister-in-law in the early 1920s. He was married a couple times, but eventually marries her, converts to Christianity. I think in 1929. And I say all that to say eventually he's going to start a new life movement, which is a pro Confucian ideal where he tries to recapture the character and kind of the conservative values of the Chinese people. But the point is, he was not this Western capitalist. He believed in the nationalization of labor and industry. He believed that the wages of the people were the government's to redistribute. The only really difference that made him not a communist was the fact that he didn't really believe in the class struggle. So a fundamental tenet of Marxism is that there is a class struggle. And he really didn't buy into that or pay much credence to it. Most of his ideology was through the kind of a Confucian ideal, vice a communist ideal. So he was really considered as more of a conservative that had some socialist tendencies. So looking at Chiang Kai-shek, there's a lot of, well, there's really two main competing theories on what he was like, and kind of evaluating his success and his ability as a leader in the Chinese. And one of the first, I guess, kind of idea on what he was like was that he was incompetent. He had a lot of support. He had a huge head start over the CCP, and that he just kind of squandered. He made a lot of bad decisions. There was a lot of criticism over him in the Shanghai Massacre. There was some criticism on his tactics against the Japanese, that he didn't do enough to stop the Japanese. Then different critics also say that he didn't do enough to stop the Chinese early enough. So there's a lot of, and he mishandled a lot of economic policies, and then within his own people, he couldn't quite rally them behind his cause. So a lot of people look back and say that he was really just incompetent, and the U.S. and the West really backed the wrong horse. But Grace Wong wrote a book called Chiang Kai-shek's Politics of Shame, and there's kind of this new critique of him that says that he really wasn't incompetent. He was actually very competent. He was just a man in an impossible situation. And we'll see this as we start getting more into the foreign involvement in the actual civil war. But you have to understand, we're in the warlord era is when he takes power. So he is a fringe revolutionary KMT movement. He has to take power. He's fighting the communists who want to take over and whose ideology ultimately doesn't align with his. He has the Japanese, the Soviets breathing down his neck to the north. Not only does he have the communists to deal with, but this was the age of warlords, and those warlords still maintained power into the late 1930s in the Second Sino-Japanese War. So it's not like he had this unified country that he was trying to hold together. It was a broken country that he was trying to put back together. And it was really just an impossible task for anyone. And the criticism that he was incompetent is largely unfair, which is kind of what, after studying this, I tend to agree with, that even though he made some mistakes, those mistakes really couldn't have been avoided. And then you got to ask yourself, what else would he have done? So that's a little bit about Chiang Kai-shek.
So, no, we here in the United States have a tendency to try to historically judge people as good or bad, like this binary, like you said, he's either incompetent or competent, right? Like he was either doing the best he could and just failed, or he sucked at what he was doing. I think the Chinese people in Chinese history have a much more nuanced approach to judging their historical characters. Again, going back to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the main characters. So, for our listeners that maybe you're just joining in on this episode, Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a very popular historical novel in China. It covers the fall of the Han Empire around I believe the 200s, maybe late 100s, 200s AD. And one of the main characters is this guy named Cao Cao. Cao Cao is a genius. He's ruthless. He gets himself into trouble all the time, but of the three kingdoms, so to speak, of this novel, he ends up becoming the most powerful guy. However, he's not able to unite the country, and he dies. and leaves the northern kingdom to his son, who also wasn't able to unite the empire. Today, Cao Cao is seen with a whole lot of nuance. Like I've had the pleasure of speaking to a few Chinese people about this character in particular, and you can just see like I've tried to like, do you like him? Do you not like him? And they're all like, oh, he's very smart, but crafty. And it's like, when we talk about Chiang Kai-shek, I think the same could be said. Like, Chiang Kai-shek was ruthless. Chiang Kai-shek was smart, and he made bad decisions, and he wasn't able to achieve his goals. And I mean, heck, Mao Zedong, like, yes, we see the posters, right? Like, we see up in, is it in Tiananmen Square, where today that rather unflattering photo, I don't know why they don't pick the pictures of when they're much younger. Like, Mao Zedong was much better looking as a younger man than he did later in life.
He lost a lot of weight on the Long March.
Exactly. And gained a lot of it in the decades that follow. But point being is that, like, even Mao Zedong, like, today is seen like the Cultural Revolution is not looked on as a good thing in China today. And it's the same folks in power. So anyway, I think it's important for us to mention, like, when we talk about Chiang Kai-shek, when we talk about Mao Zedong, these are nuanced characters from the Chinese perspective. And if we're going to understand where they're coming from, we should keep that in mind.
Yeah, and don't forget, Mao Zedong was also almost forced out of power initially. So during this Chinese Civil War, and we'll get to that, his own party tried to force him from power, and he had to retake power from his own party. So there's almost a lot of things that happened that, had the Fifth Encircle been a little bit more successful and Mao not been able to take over, or something happened a little different, history could have been, Shanghai might have remained in power. But you're right, it's extremely nuanced. I think that's the point we want to make, and it's nuanced in the sense that he was his own. He was not. It's not a binary. He wasn't necessarily good or bad, competent, incompetent, capitalist, socialist. He was a lot of different things. He trained in the Japanese army. He actually was part of the Japanese army for a little bit. He fought against the Japanese. He actually was, I forgot to mention this, he was actually influenced by the Soviets too. So what Sun Yat-sen was influenced by Mikhail Borden and the Soviets. In order to continue backing the KMT in Chiang Kai-shek, he had to let in, one of the conditions was that he had to let in the CCP as part of the KMT. And so they were at that point, we had discussed this before, kind of a political fringe of the KMT. He had to keep them in the party. That was the only way that Moscow was going to continue to back him. And they actually spoke fairly highly of Chiang Kai-shek. So they believed that he was going to be this revolutionary leader, and he was going to be, so it wasn't just the US betting on him, the Soviets bet on him too. It wasn't until the Shanghai Massacre that all of that changed. But it's important to note that it wasn't just the US that backed him. The Soviets also backed him. And then the Germans did too. So he's a complicated man with complicated nuance. That's what we're trying to say here. It's not as black and white. Speaking of the Soviets and their influence and the Germans and all of these different players. So the Soviets were primarily trying to influence an ideology and change the political fabric of China. So like we talked about last week with the US, it was really through the lens of Japan and keeping the open door policy and just keeping business as usual. The Soviets wanted a revolution. So you had Stalin and Trotsky, who were the primary players within the Communist Party and in the Soviet Union. They both viewed China as very importantly. They had differing opinions on how it needed to be handled, with Stalin being a staunch supporter of Chiang Kai-shek, while Trotsky viewed him as not a true revolutionary and not a strong ally. They both tried to influence him, and they sent different agents. And it's interesting. What were you going to say?
I had a more like broad thought on like the different. I was just going to say all these different foreign powers, like, they were still viewing China as a cohesive whole. They were not necessarily like on the geopolitical landscape. They were not looking at it from like, oh, we should support the KMT because they most closely align to our government principles. No, they were looking at it more of like, I'm trying to counter British influence. And I'm a German and I don't like the British. So, we were beefing in World War One. We're in this basic arms race today. I want China on my side because they've historically had beef with the British. You know what I mean? Like they're not looking at it from this like uh you know, Chiang Kai-shek aligns with my values. They're looking at it from the enemy of my enemy is my friend type deal.
Mao Zedong credits the Soviet Union as part of the successful revolution. So even the CCP looks at the Soviet influence and them spreading their ideology as critical to their success. And to your point about the other Western countries looking at this as like a whole, and they're trying to play each other in China. Yeah, the Russians didn't do that. They saw it as an ideology that they were trying to win over. I do want to mention the U.S. and German involvement. So the U.S., like we mentioned, had an open door policy that they wanted to maintain. And they still had some forces in the country, but they were largely in defensive positions, really just trying to defend diplomatic missions and settlements. But the Germans started a military mission in the late 20s led by Hans von Seeckt and Alexander von Falkenhausen. And they began training the nationalist army. So even though the Germans weren't directly sending tons of troops and doing direct action fights against the communists, they had sent advisors, quote unquote, to come in and train the nationalist army. And they actually implemented a lot of strategies that we'll see later with the encirclement campaigns and what they called blockhouses. But the Germans viewed the nationalists as very important to their strategic interest. And the way they went about it was through military advisors, which kind of sounds familiar because the U.S. does that a lot later. And then you've got the Japanese. So we talked last week and then over the past couple of weeks about Japan being a rising power and forcing these. The Japanese forced the 21 demands on Yuan Shikai, and they were trying to cede all this land. Well, they in 1931 seized Manchuria and part of northeast China and set up Manchukuo, which we mentioned a couple episodes again with Pu Yi, reestablishing him in Manchukuo. So you have the Japanese taking territory. You have the Soviets exporting communist ideology. You have Germans who are advising the military, and then you still have U.S. forces scattered about within the mainland of China. So though they are not directly fighting each other or the Japanese or the Chinese, they are absolutely influencing and playing a factor in what is about to happen in China.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that like all these different foreign influences were not like looking at the CCP or the KMT or any of these other warlords that existed at the time, and going, oh, here's the one that most closely aligns with my government and my ideology, so I pick them and I want them to win, which is how Americans in the 20th century began looking at geopolitics. They were looking at it more from like the enemy of my enemy is my friend type deal. And we have to remember, like, for example, British and French imperialism was like yesterday in this time. Like, for example, the Germans in this military mission, one might ask, like, why on earth were the Germans helping out the Chinese? Because we, from hindsight, already know that the later Nazis and the Japanese were friends with one another. So it's like, why were the Germans helping out the Chinese in this time? It's like, well, because they viewed China as a friendly country, because China's biggest enemies have been Russia, Great Britain, and France. And when put in that perspective, like, oh, it makes perfect sense then, because who were Germany's biggest enemies during this time? Russia, Great Britain, and France. So, of course, they're gonna be friendly to China. And Japan, like we look with retrospect on what Japan did in World War II and kind of uh prehumously. I don't even know if that's a word. Instead of posthumously, prehumously apply the atrocities that Japan committed in World War II to like the several decades prior to, when in fact they were not a evil empire, so to speak, during this time. Like there was still a lot of hope within the West that Japan could be democratized, that it could be a responsible player on the world stage. And, there wasn't this imminent war going on. As a matter of fact, just for Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States, the State Department was vigorously trying to get back to normal relations in December, the first week of December in 1941. So like, I think we don't appreciate the fact that what Japan was doing in the 30s and in the early 40s was kind of surprising to everyone. So I say all that to say, the international influence dynamic in this environment had more to do with the greater geopolitics of the day than supporting a particular ideology at the time.
I think that if we're going to look at this, the question of like, how does this influence, the U.S., what does this have to do with the U.S. and Chinese relations today? If anything, it should force us to have a long view of every decision that we make, because it's easy to look back at this in this isolated, okay, well, the Japanese did this, well, the Chinese did this in this date, without taking a much broader point. Like you said, well, the Germans were looking at this. Who were their biggest enemies at the time? They weren't Nazis in the late 20s. I mean, there was the Nazi Party, but they weren't. It was still the Weimar Republic. The Japanese were not at war with the U.S. And Chiang Kai-shek himself was part of the Japanese. He trained in Japan 20 years prior. So it's not like this was happening, in isolated incidents. If anything, we need to take an expanded view on all of the actions that we take are going to have ripple effects over decades, potentially. That's how we need to view foreign policy and geopolitics, that every decision you make is going to have a cascading effect down the road in ways that we may not be ready to anticipate.
Yeah. So just this thought popped in my head here. What I was thinking was the United States has, for the last 150 years, has had to manage a relationship with both China and Japan at the same time, right? Now that might sound like, no dud, Jay. But what I mean by that is the United States is not naturally adversarial to either Japan nor China. And this is an important point here, because you're talking about taking the long view in the broad relationship. It kind of makes sense for Japan and China to be naturally adversarial to one another, simply because they are within close proximity to one another. They are culturally distinct enough to not have a unified vision of their future together, right? And for those two factors alone, like culturally distinct, geographically close proximity, they are natural competitors with one another. Whereas the United States, we share an ocean, but that's a really freaking big ocean. and so just naturally, we are not adversarial. We are naturally inclined to try to have positive relations with both countries at the same time. But that is difficult when those two countries are adversarial in nature. So World War II, I think it's best for Westerners to think as Japan fighting the United States and Great Britain and France, just the West writ large, during World War II. That is an aberration. That is a departure from the historical norm if you're looking at the larger, like 150 years, there is no reason whatsoever for Japan to be in an adversarial relationship with America and the West. It doesn't make any sense. So that's why in this time, these powers were super friendly with China, because it doesn't make any sense for us to naturally be at war with Japan, but we were. So we were going to leverage that relationship with China so that we could win our war against Japan. Conversely, the West, because China is so big, China is a natural competitor on the geopolitical stage. And that does create some friction between other superpowers, right? And I think China recognizes this. China recognizes it is a natural superpower on the global stage. And in the same way that China and Japan are in an adversarial relationship because they're within close proximity to one another, culturally distinct, if you look at the entire world and not just Asia, now all of a sudden China becomes a more potential enemy, because now they're competing for the same spheres of influence that other superpowers, cough, the United States, are competing with. So just from like the long view of history, I'll wrap this up. From the long view of history here is Japan is not the natural enemy. Japan is a natural friend to the West. And as China grows, it moves from its historical position of friendly with the United States, kind of or friendly with the West, as what we're seeing here. And it grows into this adversarial position that's just natural. It's natural, and maybe, dare I say, may I commit the historian's fallacy of saying that it's inevitable.
That's important to note, that I think a lot of the leaders, the Chinese leaders at this time, also believed themselves that they should be a superpower, kind of this Sinocentric view of the world, because for thousands of years they were a power, and then suddenly they're not, and they just can't seem to get out of their own way. So I think that's one thing that Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong both viewed, or both shared in common, like, hey, we should be a world power. We should be on equal terms. It goes back to the unequal treaties. That was why there was such a painful time and such humiliation. Was like, we're not a power right now. We want to be a power. We should be a power. We're naturally supposed to be a power. Heck, we're twice as big as the United States is today, 100 and some years ago. So I think that's a really good point, Jay. So let's start talking about the actual civil war and the conflict between the CCP and the nationalists, because I think the first two key points about the external influences and who Chiang Kai-shek really was are going to be brought out in this. So the actual conflict begins with the Shanghai Massacre. So prior to the Shanghai Massacre, like I said, the CCP was part of the KMT. At this point, they are still not the legitimate government. The Biang government, if you remember from Yuan Shikai, the Biang army, they are still the recognized and technically legitimate government of China out of Beijing. So in order to take power, the KMT had to march north in their northern expedition and take over Beijing and northern China. If you remember, we talked about Beijing was kind of a lucrative city in that it became very wealthy. So a lot of the warlords were fighting over it. The Biang government was trying to loosely hold it. So the northern expedition goes north. It is successful. They are able to take Beijing and, I wouldn't say subjugate, but at least control nominally, at least the warlords, and put that threat down. But then in 1927, so the Communist Party began growing rapidly within the KMT. And Chiang Kai-shek, as you mentioned, is a smart man. He recognized that this was a growing problem, and he tried to handle it as discreetly as possible in order to maintain support from the Soviet Union. But in 1927, he deemed them too large and too much of a threat. So he ordered the massacre of the communists at Shanghai. I saw one estimate that said like 50,000 communists were killed. Only 10,000 of the party survived and managed to flee. And this is a seminal moment for the CCP. They look back at this as really the start of the conflict where they broke away and they began fighting the nationalists and became an enemy. During this time, so they break off, they try and form their own separate government from the KMT, who is now the nationalists have taken over China. They separate and form their own government. So this is about 1929, 1930. In order to combat the threat against the communists, Shanghai Shek has this encirclement campaign. So he has 5 campaigns of encirclement. The first 4 are unsuccessful. This strategy was proposed by the Germans, and basically what the Germans said was, if you can encircle the Chinese pockets of resistance and their pockets of influence, you can cut them off, and using your superior numbers, training, technology, you can defeat them. The problem with the first 4 were that Chiang Kai-shek was unable to mobilize enough forces within the KMT to absolutely eradicate the CCP. So that was the first problem. They didn't have enough forces. Think like the U.S. versus the Taliban in Afghanistan. In the early days of the war, the Taliban was able to escape because we could never really fully cut them off. That was one of the reasons. They just couldn't mobilize enough forces because, by the way, at this point, they're still warlords. And I said earlier, even though the Northern Expedition was successful, they still only had the nominal support at best. So there's still a threat of the warlords, and that delayed a lot of the ability of Chiang Kai-shek to marshal all his forces. Oh, and by the way, there was something called the Kamal Rebellion that occurred where it was the Uyghurs who had rebelled against the Chinese that he was dealing with. So he's still trying to maintain a tenuous situation in China and then marshal his forces. So during the first 4, even though there's some success, he ultimately loses. And what Mao at this point is the leader of the CCP. And I say leader, he's not the full leader. He hasn't consolidated complete power at this point. So there's still a lot of committees, a lot of other key influencers, but Mao is kind of like the main leader at this point, engages in guerrilla warfare. He understands that they have a bunch of peasants. They don't have the arms. They don't have the technology. They don't have the training. So he engages in guerrilla conflict against the nationalists and the KMT, using hit and run tactics, sabotage, spy networks. And it's actually, for their part, very successful. It slows the KMT down. Like I said, they don't have the numbers to fully encircle them. So they're actually able to win until the 5th encirclement campaign. So finally, Chiang Kai-shek is like, I've had enough. He marshals like some 700,000 nationalist forces, plus another, I think I saw an estimate of about 300,000 forces from the warlords. So he has about 1 million soldiers total mobilized for this 5th encirclement campaign. And he utilizes what's called the blockhouse strategy or blockhouse tactics. It was also proposed by the Germans. Basically, if you think about it, fighting defensively during an offensive campaign. So they would move forward and occupy an area and set up these blockhouses, which are basically small fortifications that would be used to cut off escape routes, avenues of approach, and force the Chinese Communist Party to attack them directly in order to retake some of that ground against a heavily fortified bunker, basically. And the Chinese, actually, the CCP actually removed Mao from power. The CCP at this point was still very young, and there was no real centralized leadership. There was Mao, who was initially in control, but now he had been forced out. They were led now by a committee of leaders that didn't really know what they were doing, to be completely honest. And they tried to engage the nationalists for a decisive victory in an open conflict, which is absolutely the worst decision they could have made. You don't want to send a bunch of peasants against machine guns and trained soldiers, which is exactly what they did. So they lose the 5th encirclement campaign badly. And this is where the Long March begins. Okay, so the Long March there's the Shanghai Massacre, which is the start of this. I said that's a seminal moment. The Long March, I almost compare this, reading about it, to like Valley Forge within the American Revolution. if for the American listeners and anybody that studied the American Revolution, Valley Forge, the U.S. was actually not doing that great during the Revolution, and they had withdrawn to winter quarters in Valley Forge and faced a really difficult winter where they trained. But then they came out of it kind of stronger, and they had centralized leadership and training, and they had a renewed vigor, and it became this kind of call to arms and this inspirational story for other revolutionaries for them to look back on. Very similar to the CCP. As a matter of fact, this is where they centralized their leadership. And during the march, initially it was terrible. They were poorly supplied. They were constantly getting harassed. And along the way, Mao became the sole leader. And under his guidance, he was able to rally a lot of the peasants along the way and link up with other communist leaders, because right now they were leaving the Jiangxi Soviet area, and that's in southeastern China, and they needed to retreat both west and north to the mountains in a very safe area. They covered some like 56 to 6,000 miles. They crossed all of these rivers. It was a very dangerous journey, but they utilized that and they lost like half the remaining forces that survived the encirclement campaigns. They lost half of the survivors of that on this long march back. They were able to meet up with some other communists in the area and kind of rally their forces. And I think the success of the Long March was not just the consolidated leadership, but the story that it created, this almost kind of this divine success and their ability to survive this hardship and come together. It became a rallying cry for the peasant class. The peasants and the working class looked at this and they're like, this Mao Zedong, he led this long march and they survived all these hardships. We want to follow him. So the Long March, so even though they lost the Fifth Encirclement campaign, the Long March was actually successful from an ideological, strategic standpoint, because they were able to consolidate where they were. They were able to shore up a true defensive territory and reconsolidate. For the nationalists, the Fifth Encirclement campaign was a tactical victory, but the communists escaped, and he really was not in a much better position. So this was like 1934, like toward the end of 1934, October. By 1935, it's not like his position was much better. The Communist Party still existed. Now they existed in a mountainous rural area where he had plenty of support, and it'd be extremely difficult for him to go after. By the way, the Japanese who have taken Manchuria are now looking more and more aggressive. He still has warlords to deal with, which are also a pain. He had the Kemal rebellion with the Uyghurs, and then he had there's a Fujian uprising as well within his own KMT. So it's not, he has all of these different kind of breakaway factions that he's dealing with, plus the CCP. He also has to deal with the support that he had after the Shanghai rebellion, or excuse me, the Shanghai massacre. When he did that, the working class and the peasants basically viewed him as someone who was not on their side because he killed a lot of them. Also, the kind of the intellectual class fled the universities and joined the communists. That's kind of a recurring trend. They're generally in a revolution. This is coming straight from the CCP's mouth. They're sort of the initiators, the instigators, if you will, of these revolutions. They all left as well. And Chiang was left with the cities. And in those cities, there was kind of this beat down and broken class that had supported him. And they were composed, and they had a real like moral crisis of identity and support. So they kind of nominally supported him, but they really weren't willing to fight and die for him like the CCP was. And that's why politically, he launched what was called the New Life movement, which was trying to a return to Confucian ideals. And that was his last gasp attempt to kind of recreate this Chinese identity in order to combat all of these internal and external threats that he kind of felt helpless against. Jay, sorry, I might have got a little ahead of myself. What were you going to say about the Long March?
No, it's all good. So I would just want to recall everyone to the Chinese idea of the strategic retreat. We had mentioned a few episodes ago about how one of the most frustrating things that Chiang Kai-shek would do in World War II was he was this big fan of the strategic retreat. And he didn't invent this. And it's something that is interesting because it's like from a military standpoint, it's like blasphemous in the West. Is others, probably Henry Kissinger's done the best job in his book on China on comparing and contrasting the Western. Well, I say the Western. It wasn't invented in the West. I think chess was invented in India, but it's become super popular in the West. Contrasting chess with, sorry, yeah, comparing and contrasting chess with the game of Wei-Chi, or in Japan it's known as Go. Whereas there's, Go is this indirect encirclement, etc. Whereas chess is you take pieces off the board by directly attacking them. The strategic retreat from a Chinese perspective is seen as a wise tactical move by retreating into your large country and just devouring your enemy along the way. So when we think about the CCP and the Long March is not viewed as like the Chinese equivalent to the Trail of Tears, right? It's viewed as hard, like a lot of them died. However, it's viewed positively as, wow, look at this really smart and intelligent move that they made by escaping from the jaws of death and living to fight another day. This is important for Americans and Westerners to understand China, because it's the same mentality of the CCP today. When we talk about the long game, chronologically speaking, that China likes to play, they do not view setbacks in the same way that the West does. Like we see setbacks as failures, whereas they see setbacks as potential opportunities for success. I mean, heck, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, they've named some of their rockets after the Long March. Like, I forget, I don't know the exact nomenclature, but like, there's literally, they named a missile called the Long March. So it's like, they celebrate the Long March. They look at this as like, we were literally all about to die, and we almost all died. Like, they see it as a good thing. And it all goes back to this idea of a strategic retreat being a good thing, not a bad thing.
I think Chiang Kai-shek kind of also recognized that too. So it's interesting because afterward, he was really criticized by a lot of his generals, those in the KMT, for not being aggressive enough and going after the Chinese Communist Party. And I think he recognized that there's no way that I can go on this wild goose chase in the mountains of Western China to go get them. He's like, that's why I'm not going. I know I need to fight them. I know, and I'm going to hold on, but I can't just go out, march way out into the mountains of Western China to go hunt them down. He's like, he's like, we'll never come back. And I think you're right. I think Chiang Kai-shek recognized that. I don't know if it's written anywhere. It evades me, but I think in the back of his mind, because he's a military guy, he recognizes that that's a losing fight if we do that. He's like, we're playing right into their hands.
In this, the area that the Chinese communists retreated to, the main city was a city called Chang'an. Chang'an is a historical capital of Chinese empires. Like, for example, in the Han, kind of the equivalent to the Roman Empire for China, the Han, it was one of their main capitals. I forget the other one, but the other one was like along the Yellow River, whereas this one is like up in the mountains, and its Chang'an is protected by a series of mountain passes. So like it is very defensible from a topological standpoint, but it's also like a historical power base to the Chinese people. So for Mao to set up his capital in Chang'an, which is this historical power base of Chinese empires, it was a brilliant move, because Chiang Kai-shek, the KMT's power base was historically in the south. Guangzhou was where the KMT was formed, where Sun Yat-sen kind of hung out. Um, and then they kind of settled in Nanjing or Peking, same place, as opposed to Beijing, because Beijing was, for starters, too close to the Japanese at this time. And like you said, Colin, at the beginning of this episode, kind of a new power base, not a historical power base, but a new one. Since the Qing, that's why Beijing is so far north, because the Qing were Manchurian, and they came from the north. Anyway, I say all that to say, for Mao to retreat to Chang'an, a highly defensible historical power base, Chiang Kai-shek would have been super dumb to try to exterminate them. He would have been fighting.
He would have been
a
playing into
guerrilla
their
war
hands
forever.
He would have given
Exactly.
them another victory, because he would have attacked and lost, and then it would have been like the reverence of Mao and his prowess and military tactics would have gone up even more, and Chiang Kai-shek would have lost then and there. So it is important to see. And so, Jay, I think we've kind of reached a logical stopping point before we get into the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in World War II. And just to kind of recap this, like we mentioned in the beginning, this is not the American Civil War, where there's these pitched campaigns and very specific battles and movements of territory. And then, this is a definitive start and end to these battles. And this is where we're going to attack with clearly delineated lines. That doesn't necessarily exist here. Basically, the Shanghai Massacre occurred. A lot of communists died. There was these encirclement campaigns that were largely unsuccessful, but then finally successful, and a lot of communists died. And then there was the Long March, where even more communists died, but they achieved, Jay, I think you put it very well, a spiritual victory. They reoccupied a historical capital that had meant a lot to the Chinese people. Their legend grew amongst the peasants, the peasant and working class, and they gained support. So they're in actually a pretty good spot, believe it or not, after all those losses for years. And this is 1935 at this point, October 1935, where Chiang Kai-shek, he now has to deal with the communists in the north and the west, the Japanese to his north and east. He's dealing with his own kind of rebellious internal strife with these warlords who he's still trying to appease, his own faction who thinks that he needs to make a more aggressive stance on the Chinese. As a matter of fact, there's like a 2-week period where one of his generals took him captive. And then he's also got Soviet influence. He's got these American armies, which he really didn't get along with the Americans that well. We can talk about this next week, but Joseph Stilwell, who was the general for the China, Burma, India campaigns, did not get along at all with Chiang Kai-shek. He loved the Chinese people, but he did not get along with him at all. FDR wasn't a big fan of Chiang Kai-shek. I say all that to say, and then his people were also kind of at this kind of deflated, demoralized, just from decades and decades of getting beat down and Western influence kind of seeping in there. So he tried to start the New Life movement to reinvigorate and create a new identity that would bring his people around his cause, vices the CCP, who had a message of anti-imperialism that really resonated with people who had been oppressed by these imperialists for decades. So that's sort of where we're at. And then and then World War II breaks out.
No, that was a really good synopsis, Colin. Thanks for that. It's oftentimes our American Western history books kind of start at World War II, and we don't fully understand what got us there. And a lot of it is really pertinent to understanding what's going on today. Like you can't understand 2022, soon to be 2023 Chinese Communist Party without learning about the Long March. Like they just had their party congress back in October. And there's very much like still a sense of pride in where the CCP has come from, in what it's overcome to get where it's at. That's the artifacts of their culture. So no, thanks for that synopsis, Colin. For our listeners, really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave us a review. That is the best way to get the podcast out there. If you leave us a 5-star review, we will give you a shout out on this episode. So you can do that on Spotify or Apple or Podcast Addict. Give us that 5-star review. Let us know what you think. Give us some feedback, and we'll give you a shout out here. If you have other constructive feedback for us, you can reach us elsewhere, like on social media. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you, both good and bad. Give us your thoughts. Give us your opinions. Are we off base? Are we crushing it? You tell us. We want to know. So yeah, thanks for joining us on this episode. Looking forward to finally digging into World War II, one of my favorite eras of history, in our next episode. And until then, we'll see you on the Loins of History.